Welcome, AP Economics students. This is Ms. Foley, and today we are going to review basic economic concepts, supply and demand, that sort of situation for the AP exam. One thing that you need to make sure you understand is this unit is shown in the macroeconomics test and the microeconomics test. So you'll see it in both possibly, especially when we're talking about this online exam format. There could be a scenario where elements of both of the exams feature this in one way, shape, or form. So just a quick review. When we take a look at the demand curve and when we take a look at the supply curve, um, there's things that shift the demand curve, and these are the only things that shift them. Okay, so one of the biggest misconceptions I think that students make is they think that change in the individual price of an item would shift the demand curve, and that's just not true. The change in price is because of the result of a shift in the demand curve, or just because the price changed. It doesn't have anything to do with causing a shift. So when we take a look at things that shift the demand, tastes and preferences is the first one. This makes sense. Maybe, for example, during COVID-19, online groceries become more of a preference instead of going out and getting groceries. So you can say the demand for online groceries goes up. That's a change in a taste, that's a change in a preference. Consumer income. We know that if things are normal goods, when consumer income goes up, normal goods increase. These are things like brand items, things that are more expensive. If you say steak versus ground beef, if you say Nike sneakers versus Kmart sneakers, those are normal goods versus inferior. Inferior goods would be more like the ground beef, like the Kmart sneakers, and we see the demand for that go up when consumer income goes down. So understanding that relationship is super important. The number of buyers, obviously, if there is an increase in the number of buyers in an area, that's going to increase the demand. The expectations of future prices. If you think that the availability of something or that the prices of something in the future are going to go up, consumer behavior dictates that that means that the demand today would increase. Would increase prices of complementary and substitute goods. So this is the only time that when a price of something changes, the demand curve changes. And notice that it's not the price of the actual good, but complementary goods. Complementary goods are things that you buy along with the goods. So for example, if we're dealing with the supply and demand curve of hot dogs, a complementary good would be hot dog buns. So that's what they're talking about, that when you change the price in hot dog buns, that might impact the demand in hot dogs. Substitute goods, these are things that you buy instead of. So instead of buying hot dogs, maybe you buy hamburgers. So if you change the price in hamburgers, they go down, then maybe people demand less hot dogs because they go for the substitute. So these are things, I think you'll see it probably a little bit more in the microeconomics exam than the macroeconomics exam. It might be a little portion of it, and that's the demand curve. Okay. Shifts in the supply curve. This is a little bit harder for kids to grasp, but when you're talking about shifts in the supply curve, you are talking about the producer's perspective. So you're talking about input costs. When labor becomes more expensive, supply decreases. When raw materials become more expensive, supply decreases. So that sort of thing. When you're talking about per unit taxes, which would make supply go down, or subsidies, which is the opposite of a tax. A subsidy is when the government says, oh, we really want you to do something, so we're going to give you some extra money. I would assume during COVID-19, the federal government is looking at medical companies or medical supply companies and saying, hey, we're going to give you this subsidy. We're going to give you some extra money, which is going to increase the supply of the medical supplies that the government wants to be available. Number of sellers. Obviously, the more sellers that there are, the more supply that there is. Think about what that does to price and quantity, and vice versa. Productivity and technology. Generally, when technology comes along and it makes things more efficient, it makes things more quickly, that's going to increase in supply. Sometimes productivity or technology might go down, and that would work in the other direction. The same situation is with future price expectations with producers. They're going to want to produce more when the prices are higher. So think about that. Very important to note that in economics, when you shift anything to the left, any curve, that's going to be less. And when you shift any curve to the right, that is going to be more. Make sure that you always draw new equilibriums and arrows to show your work. So this is your shifts in your demand, your shifts in your supply. Okay, that is a key part of that first economic concept. When we take a look at Unit 1, and I know this is so long ago, this is back in your summer work, this is back in September, but when you take a look at Unit 1, make sure you understand the difference between a movement and a shift. When we are drawing a supply and demand curve, a movement is one of these little dots. A lot of times you might just move along the curve for a variety of reasons, maybe just because you feel like it. A shift is when you're drawing a brand new curve. So make sure you understand the differences between those two things. Make sure that you see those things and get an idea when you're being asked a question about that. Price ceilings are always below the equilibrium price. They always cause shortages. People find that really confusing because I don't know about you, when I think about ceiling, I look up. Well, no, price ceiling is actually below the equilibrium. That's when it's an effective binding price ceiling. Vice versa, price floors, they're only binding and effective when they are above the equilibrium price. So again, it's the opposite kind of intuitive of what you would think. That's a confusing topic. That's why I put it in this slide. Anytime you see the word marginal in economics, you should think additional. You should think one more. We start to see that a little bit in Unit 1. We see it a whole lot in microeconomics, which we'll review in a few days from now. But that's what you should be thinking. Opportunity cost is another way of saying opportunity lost. So this is, because you're making this decision, you can no longer do this. Because you decided to study for economics, you can no longer binge that next episode of Tiger King on Netflix. Okay? So opportunity cost is opportunity lost. And I have a feeling on this online learning, on this free response exam, because there's no graphical element of it, that they might ask you more questions about that. And I'll show you a little bit about that in a few minutes. When they ask you about the PPC curve, it is concave to the origin because the reason why it is shaped like this is that different items are going to require different resources and different specialization. If your economy only produces two things, let's just make it simple. Let's say it's nursery rhymes, which my son is listening to downstairs. I'm not sure if you can hear that, and pizza. So if you could take a look at those two things, what you do to produce nursery rhymes is very different than what you use to make pizza. And that's why we have that concave shape of the curve. Okay. When you take a look at trade, which again, I have a feeling they might ask maybe one little bit of a question about this. When they ask you about trade, you want to make sure that you understand that the terms are beneficial depending on the particular country or the particular unit's um, opportunity costs. And we'll see an example of that. Okay. Um, so we have absolute advantage and comparative advantage. We don't always have an absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is when one country can produce more of a good with the same put as another with using the same or fewer resources. That doesn't always happen. They may ask you about it. In a few moments, we'll take a look at a review question with that. A comparative advantage sometimes occurs when a country can produce more of a good with a lower opportunity cost, and they might be more influential in that production because they have that lower opportunity cost. So this is kind of like a Reader's Digest version, kind of everything I can put on a screen of everything from Unit 1 and Unit 2. I thought the price controls were a little tricky. That's why I put those there. I put the PPC curve, just reminding you about what the shape is, reminding you that inside the PPC curve, that's an inefficient use of resources, that outside the PPC curve can't occur unless there's some form of economic growth. And very important to realize that anything that is actually on the PPC curve, so in this example, point A, point B, point Q, point D, point E, point F, they're all efficient combinations. Yes, they're all different combinations, but those are all efficient. Okay? Um, in terms of quantity controls, sometimes we see this. Sometimes there might be a license. There might be a situation where the government, maybe they don't want people overfishing in a certain area. They'll put a license on that and they'll put a quantity control. And so that's what it looks like on a regular supply and demand graph. It's just a vertical line at where you want the quota, where you want people to stop. And we call that lack of economic transactions that couldn't happen because of the quota. We call that dead weight loss, which of course we spend more time in microeconomics dealing with. Okay, so here's a crazy big overview of Unit 1 and Unit 2. When I think about how they may ask these types of questions, I look at previous AP exams. This is a question number 3 from the 2008 AP exam, and I have a feeling during online learning that something kind of similar like this might show up on the micro exam or maybe even the macro exam in some way, shape, or form. Because you don't need to draw a graph, you need to analyze a graph. And in this online learning, they're more into you explaining things. Do you understand the concept? That sort of thing. So I'm given this question, and it's got 4 parts to it. The diagram above shows the production possibilities curve for 2 countries. The countries are Artland and Rayland. Using equal amounts of resources, Artland can produce 600 hats or 300 bicycles, whereas Rayland can produce 1,200 hats or 300 bicycles. So at first, before I even look at these, A, B, C, and D, I would figure out the opportunity cost and I would write that down if I were you. So that's how I would approach this question. Figure out the opportunity cost first because you know that A, B, C, and D are going to have you use the opportunity cost to do some deeper analysis. Now, just looking at the graph, this line is Rayland and this line is Artland. So just looking at it, I noticed that Rayland has an absolute advantage in producing hats. They can make 1,200 hats if that's all they were doing. Artland can only make 600 hats if that's all they were doing. So there's an absolute advantage for making hats. For bicycles, if they both just decided that they can only make bicycles, guess what? Nobody has an absolute advantage because they can make the equal amount. How do you figure out the opportunity costs? Well, you just do a little division, okay? Artland, if they make only um, if they make only hats or only bikes, we can do 600 divided by 300 and realize that if Artland wants to make one bike, that they're going to give up two hats. 600 divided by 3 gives me the 2. That's where I got the 2 from. So if I am Artland and I make one bike, I am going to be giving up 2 hats. If I flip that around, if I'm Artland and I make one hat, I'm going to be giving up a half a bike. So in terms of one bike, giving up 2 hats, that's my opportunity cost. One hat, giving up a half a bike, that is my opportunity cost. Okay? Rayland, it's going to be 1,200 divided by 300. Okay, they can make 1,200 hats, which means that 1,200 divided by 300, that's going to give you 4 hats. Every time Rayland says, I'm going to make one bike, they are giving up 4 hats. If they are making one hat, they're giving up a quarter of a bike. So even though the question didn't ask me to do that, I figured out the opportunity cost because I know, even though it didn't ask me directly, that indirectly I'm going to be using this information to conduct this analysis. So letter A says calculate the opportunity cost of a bicycle in Artland. That was pretty easy. Okay, one bike equals 2 hats. Make sure you show the 600 divided by 300. That's your calculation. That's your showing your work, if you will. And that's that. Okay. If 2 countries specialize and trade, which country will import bikes? Well, whoever has the lower opportunity cost is going to do it. Rayland has a lower opportunity cost. They will import bicycles because they have a lower opportunity cost. For them, Rayland, when they make a hat, they give up a quarter of a bike. When Artland makes a hat, they give up a half a bike. So it makes sense for Rayland to import bikes because they're not giving up as much when they make hats instead of bikes. So they're going to import bikes, they're going to export hats. Rayland has a lower opportunity cost. You could say Rayland has a comparative advantage. That would be okay. In hats, you can say Artland has a comparative advantage in bicycles as your explanation. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can explain this. Just make sure that you have a correct way. So lower opportunity cost, comparative advantage. For either one, that's where you're going to get that to make sense. In terms of a trade, if the trade is 5 hats for one bicycle, who would the trade be advantageous for? So remember, Rayland is getting bikes, okay, and giving away hats. So in terms of one bike, so Rayland is getting bikes, which means they would have to give Artland 5 hats. Would that be advantageous to them? No. The trade is going to be advantageous for Artland because they are going to be getting 5 hats, and Rayland is not going to be advantageous because if they were to do this on their own, they would be able to have they would not have to give up the 5 hats. Okay, so for them it doesn't really make sense because if they were to just do it themselves, they would be able. They could, instead of Rayland getting a bike, they could just make 4 hats. So they're giving up more in the trade. Okay. If productivity in Artland triples, which country has an comparative advantage in the production of hats? Rayland has a comparative advantage still in producing hats. Even if you triple the numbers, it still works out for them. Okay, so this is just kind of a review on what a question would look like. Again, sorry about the nursery rhymes in the background. But this is just kind of giving you an overview of Unit 1. If you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. Have a good one.